We have so much to share with us, so we'll start right away, Kurt. Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. You were just 6 years of age when you left Germany with your parents in 1936. Before we turn to your parents' decision to leave Germany and what that meant for you and your family, tell us what you can about your family and their lives prior to Hitler and the Nazi Party taking control of Germany.
Well, both of my parents had their families, had lived for quite some time in Germany. My mother in the Aachen area, my father in the southern parts of Germany in Bavaria. And his father had a small hotel in the city of Würzburg, which is a university town. And then when he married my mother, he went into his new father-in-law's business, which was in a butcher, and tried to expand that business. And then this was shortly before the Nazis came in, and then when the Nazis came in, they began to force him to close some of the businesses, and eventually he thought it was best to leave.
Before we go there, Kurt,
Yes.
just a couple of other things for you to share with us. When did your father become a chef?
Well, he became a chef actually before the First World War. And he was in the First World War, and since he came from Bavaria and he was a cook and chef, he was assigned to the staff of the King of Bavaria. At that time, there was still a king in Bavaria, and he was on the staff there as a cook. And I suppose that was better than being on the front lines. He said at least they were never hungry. But
tell us a little bit about your mother.
My mother's family, of course, had lived in the Aachen area for a long time and had many relatives there, including the one you just referred to in the Hollander. Mrs. Frank's maiden name was Hollander, and they had also lived in Aachen for quite some time. And it was a small Jewish community, so the people were very close. Even, second cousins were pretty close.
And speaking of second cousins, how large of an extended family did you have?
I don't know. My mother had 3 siblings. My mother was a twin, and her sister, her twin sister, died in one of the flu epidemics after the First World War. And the oldest sister married and was also living in the Aachen area. And she had a brother, my uncle Alfred, whose son, my first cousin, is still living in Israel.
Today.
They fled Germany right after Kristallnacht when my uncle was arrested and put in jail, and the way you got out of jail was that you could show that you were going to leave the country. This was when the policy of the German government was just to get the Jews out of Germany. This was before, because later, of course, they ran into the problem of the final solution. So,
would you say, Kurt, that in the time before Hitler came to power, that your family enjoyed a relatively comfortable life?
Yes. They were integrated well into German society, and they felt very much at home. Although there were always some elements of anti-Semitism underlying, but they were not so disturbing and not as violent as what happened later on when Hitler came to power.
And once Hitler did come to power, soon after that, your parents made a huge decision to leave Germany. What can you tell us about those circumstances that compelled them to want to leave?
Well, my father, who had been, as I said before, in the First World War, was very much concerned about where to go. But he came to the conclusion that it was not enough to leave Germany, that we had to leave Europe. As he said in more colorful language, we have to go across the waters. And he had an older brother who had come to the States before the First World War. And my father had visited him several times after the First World War, before he was married.
You visited him here in the United States?
Yes, he lived in New York, actually. And he had a butcher's store in Manhattan. But sometime between... So my father had been exposed to the United States, and he would have thought of it as a place that he might want to go if he had to leave Germany. Unfortunately, sometime between last seeing his brother and the time Hitler came into power, Uncle Max had died. So my parents had no other contacts in the United States.
So that option was closed.
So that option was, yes. Fortunately, my mother had relatives in Palestine. They had been ardent Zionists, had nothing to do with Adolf Hitler. They had gone there before Hitler ever came to power. She had 2 sets of aunts and uncles there and a handful of cousins. And they informed my parents of an agreement that had been negotiated by the Jewish Agency in Palestine with the British and with the German governments to allow German Jews to emigrate to Palestine under more favorable conditions than if they went other places at that time. I didn't know, at the age of 6, of course, I knew nothing about that. I learned about that, actually, in more detail when I became a volunteer here in the museum, and in one of our history courses that volunteers took, one of the historians was talking to me on a break, and he asked me how I got here, and I explained it to him, and he said, "Oh, you went under the agreement." So that's when I researched that. Actually, about 10,000 German Jews got to Palestine under that agreement.
Under that agreement?
And what happened was there was a lot of objections from the Arab population in the area about all these Jews coming in, and the British cut off that immigration. And one of the other benefits was you would actually become a citizen of Palestine after 2 years under this agreement. And since the Jews had lost their citizenship in Germany, that seemed to be a plus. So at least you would belong someplace.
And that'll turn out later. You'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yes, a little bit.
Kurt, a couple of things about your period, in your early years before you went to Palestine. Do you have memories of that time living in Germany before you left?
Yes, I have some. Of course, when my father started to think about leaving, and then when he decided to he would go to Palestine, he tried to convince many other members of our family to emigrate also, because he felt it was getting more dangerous in Germany. However, they were not really prepared for that yet. They didn't think it would be so bad. Many of them were optimistic that Hitler would perhaps be voted out again or whatever. And the older people, my father's mother was living, and my mother's father, so those were my 2 living grandparents when I was born. They felt they were too old to do that. And perhaps they might join us later once we got acclimated to this new country. But at that time they said, well, we're old and retired. What are they going to do to us anyway? Little did they know. I mean, nobody suspected anything like that, I'm sure. And so the only other person, well, actually 2 members of our family ended up in Palestine. One was this cousin Walter, who had preceded us by about a year or a year and a half in Palestine. And he was more like an uncle to me because he was so much older. I was 6 years old. He was getting ready to get married, as you saw in the picture. He was an adult. And then my mother's brother, my uncle Alfred, who was a teacher in Germany, was arrested during Kristallnacht, and ended up in jail. And the only way that he would get out was if they could show that they would leave Germany. That was a very common thing that the Nazis did at that time.
Imprison you and then say, if we let you out, you got to leave the country.
That's right.
Yeah.
And my aunt, his wife, started wondering where they could go. And she had some relatives in Palestine as well from her family side. And what they did was they went to the British consulate in their area and convinced them to give them visitors' visas to go to Palestine. And these visas were good for, I don't remember exactly, but it was less than a year period. But they got to Palestine as visitors. And then when the visa started expiring and the British started looking for them to have them leave, they had gone into hiding. And the British couldn't find them. And then the war broke out, and there they were in Palestine. And that's what saved them.
Kurt, you had a nanny in Germany. Will you tell us a little about her?
Yes. But my wife, my mother, as you noted, was also in the business. And of course, she was busy during the day, and she hired a young woman to look after me. And one time when we were invited back to Germany, to the Aachen area.
This was 1996, I think?
Yes. We were invited by the Historical Society of Eilendorf, and we went there, and they had found my nanny. She was still in the area, and we had a reunion. I mean, I hardly remembered her that well.
Right.
Because I was so young then. But she remembered me very well and actually gave me some pictures that we didn't have of our family that she had.
And she also shared with you some things about what happened to the family, right?
Yes. And anyway, we ended up
on the nanny, when you went back in '96, she's the one who told you about seeing the brown shirts out. Tell us about that.
Well, of course, my mother was not as anxious to leave as my father at first. But when one of the brown shirts appeared outside the store in Eilendorf, discouraging people from buying from a Jewish store, she decided that maybe things were really getting worse than she had thought. And it convinced her to go along with my father's plans of leaving Germany. And and his experience in the First World War was that he saw the German army occupying these surrounding countries very quickly. Although the First World War, the Dutch had been able to maintain independence and were not pulled into the war. But my father was concerned that another war might break out, and if you went to one of these surrounding countries, then you would find yourself under Nazi domination again. And this is what happened, of course, to many people, including the Franks Annie Frank's parents, who went to Holland just for that reason. And Otto Frank, who was also in the First World War, didn't consider that. He didn't come to the same conclusion as my father.
Before you left for Palestine, you started school. What do you
Yes.
remember about your school experience?
Well, that was the funny thing. Although we already had our papers and everything had been arranged for the trip to Palestine, the law was at the age of 6 you had to go into school. And at that time, if I'm not mistaken, the school year started after Easter. And so when I would be in March, when I became 6, I had to go to school. And fortunately, there was a Jewish school in Aachen, so I didn't have to go to a public school, where some of the children at that time, Jewish children, were already beginning to have problems. But I had to take the trolley into Aachen to go to the school from Eilendorf. And my father was sometimes concerned, that his little boy, all alone
Riding a trolley?
on the trolley all the way to Aachen. Although I don't know, nothing ever happened, but he was very concerned. And he would sometimes follow the trolley on a bicycle, make sure that everything went smoothly.
Why do you think he didn't ride the trolley with you as opposed to following you on a bike?
Well, I think because he didn't want to frighten me, I suppose, partly. So I went to that school. I can remember the school. I have some pictures in my mind about that school, which I remember the first day I walked into the classroom and there was a picture on the board that someone had drawn in colored chalk of a little boy, coming to school on his first day. And that's
You remember that?
I remember that. I also remember that the urinals were in the courtyard outside, and if it was raining and you had to go to one of the urinals, you'd get wet. And I got wet several times.
Kurt, even although you were just 6 when you left Germany for
Yes.
Palestine, you recall leaving and that it was difficult for you. Tell us what you can about leaving and saying goodbye to your family members and then
Yes.
going to Palestine.
Well, once we had decided and a date was set, mother was not my fraternal grandmother, paternal grandmother, was not in the Aachen area, so we had to go to Würzburg, where she was still living. And the picture you saw before when you walked in, of me standing in front of the fountain, was taken on one of those trips. She lived on a square, and in the center of the square was the fountain. That's where this picture
photo came from.
was taken. And as I said before, neither she nor my grandfather, who was my mother's father, felt that they would go with us at that time. And of course, what happened was they were caught up in the war, and we know what happened to them. They were both caught up as Jews and sent to Theresienstadt. My grandmother died in Theresienstadt, according to the records. My grandfather was sent on to one of the killing camps, Majdanek, and of course was killed on arrival, and we know that happened. In fact, and then my mother's elder sister, Rose, who had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy who was about my age. He was the youngest. We know, we found nothing in the records of what happened to them. Those records were perhaps destroyed, who knows. The Germans were very good at record keeping, but there was nothing found on them, except from one of this trip that we took to Eilendorf that I just discussed before, where the local historical society invited us. When we got home, we received a letter from Germany. And it was from a woman who wrote to us that she had been a friend of my cousin Ilse, who was the oldest girl in my aunt's family. And they had been in school together. And she thought perhaps I would like a picture of her. And she had a class picture, which included my cousin, and she sent that to us. And she said when the Jews were segregated, these two girls, who were very close apparently, would clandestinely meet in a public park, and they would set a date for the next meeting, and that way they were kept in touch. And she said one time, the last time that they had set a meeting, she went to the park and my cousin never showed up, and she never knew what happened to her. And probably, of course, they were picked up in some
But to this
action.
day, you don't know the details.
We don't know anything about what happened to them specifically.
Kurt, your family, before they left Germany for Palestine,
Yes.
sold the family butcher business and sold it, I think, to your father or grandfather's apprentice.
Yes. Well, they sold the business in Eilendorf.
Okay.
Because that had a house that they owned. It was in the house that they owned. The other shops were rented, so there was, by that time, nothing else to sell. It was sold to an apprentice, and we returned to that home many years later, and my cousin, who was the son of my mother's father, Uncle Alfred, was in Germany with the Israeli Foreign Service. That was his career. He ended up in the Israeli Foreign Service. And at that time, Germany was still split between East and West, and the temporary capital was now, for West Germany, was in Bonn, which is not too far from Aachen. And that's where he was. And we got together, and on one of our first trips to Europe, after the war, and we actually made arrangements to go to that house. And it was a bit of an experience. Jill was along with us on that trip, of course, and we led Jill. We thought maybe it'd be easier when we knocked if there was a woman there to talk to the people who were living in the house, who were descendants of this apprentice.
So same family had kept
yes.
the house.
And the apprentice was not living anymore, of course, and but his daughter and her husband were living in the house, and the son, their son, was running the butcher business. And we knocked on the door, and Jill explained who we were, and they invited us in. Jill always says, when she started to speak to this woman, the woman replied, she said it was like a recording that she had in her mind as to what to do if this ever happened, because she just seemed to let it all come out, the history that she knew about. And we spent some time with that family.
And they were able to tell you things
Yes.
about you and your
and
family.
they told us something about what happened to our grandfather. And they said, well, Mr. Hertz, was now, they took the old people and put them in what had been an old age home for Jewish citizens in the city of Aachen. And he was sent there. And unfortunately, they didn't get very much sufficient food.
Right.
when the war broke out. And she said he used to come the back way, and and they would give him food because, of course, they felt sorry, which was a great risk on their part as well, because if they had been spotted, they could have gotten into considerable trouble.
That must have been very powerful for you to be
It
there,
was.
having this man who had been a child who now lived in what had been your family's home, telling you what happened to your grandfather.
Yes, it was very disturbing, of course. And when we left the house, all of us were quite disturbed. I had remembered the house somewhat. I had some memories of my bedroom and looking out the window there. There was a garden next door which I could look into, and when we went through the house, I saw that garden as well. And then when we got back after we'd gone through the house and were talking with this family, the man turned to me. He said, I saw you when you came to the kitchen. You saw what change we made there. And the story there is, one of my earliest memories was of my running in the house, and the kitchen was sunken. It was a sunken kitchen. It was down a step from the level of the rest of the house. And I fell down that step. I was a little boy and fell flat on my face, and I bled like a stuck pig, as they say. Mm-hmm. And when I walked through the kitchen, it wasn't sunken. And I must have, and I remember thinking, I said, where did that memory come from?
It's not what I remember.
That's what I remember. And he said, he saw me react, and he said, you saw what we did in the kitchen. We evened out the floor. So it was the right kitchen, as it turned out. But we left very disturbed, all three of us, when we left that house.
Kurt, tell us about going to Palestine. First, how'd you get there, and then what was it like?
Well, of course, for a 6-year-old, it was very exciting. We were going to go on a big ship, and of course we had all these trips back to my father's mother. Several times, and my father still tried to get them,
convince them to go,
but with no success. And finally, it was time to leave. It was summertime. It was about the middle of the year when we left, and we sailed from France on a ship to Haifa, and we ended up living in Haifa for our time. My father also had, besides my mother's relatives, as I said, there was my cousin Walter, and that's how he got into the trucking business. He had been in communication with his nephew Walter and said, what can I do in Palestine? We're not going to have enough money to open a restaurant. Mm-hmm. And Walter said, well, we could go into the trucking business. He said, because this is a new, burgeoning economy, and maybe we could make a living on that. And so my father bought a truck, and had it sent to Palestine. You could do this under this agreement.
You could buy a truck in Germany.
You could buy things in Germany and ship them. And even as late as when Jill's family left Germany, which was much later, Jews could still buy things if they had funds, still at that time, which they did have some, and ship them to where they were going.
So he used his German truck to start his trucking business.
Right, and I can remember going on that truck. Sometimes when I wasn't in school or vacation time or whatever, and they went out, they sometimes took me along. So a lot of their business was with soft drinks. They would transport soft drinks from Haifa to surrounding area, and then I'd get one of those drinks. I can remember that.
Despite starting the trucking business, there wasn't enough business for them to do it alone, right?
It turned out there wasn't quite enough to support two families, right. And then my father thought maybe he should leave Palestine. My father was not an ardent Zionist. I mean, he had nothing against the Zionists. He was very happy, and he was very happy to be in Palestine and not in Germany at that time. But he saw that it was getting very different.
And you tried other things as well, right, to earn a living? He took a boarder in your...
Well, yes, he took boarders, but it was not sufficient. And what happened was, in the time that we were in Palestine, another brother of my father's, my Uncle Theodore, got to the United States through his wife's family. My Aunt Julia's brother had come to the United States long before with the war, and he had, as a very, very young man, and gone into business, and he married. And he married a woman also of German extraction, because their parents, whom I still met, who were quite elderly at the time, had come to the Cincinnati as little children from Germany. And they were living there. Now, these people were not Jewish, but they, of course, but this was family for them. Not us, but the three sisters. This man had three sisters, and he felt it was time to get them out of Germany and brought them in. And these people were then willing to sponsor us as well. They were very nice people. I can
sponsor you
remember them
coming to the
very
U.S.
well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Before we talk further about that, just a couple of other questions about your time in Palestine. You went to school.
Yes.
What was it like for you now in school?
Well, initially, of course, I didn't understand a word of Hebrew, and so I was a little concerned. And my mother always told me I'd come home crying from school, complaining, "Well, I don't even understand the teacher." But at that age, you learn languages very quickly, and so...
Was language a problem for your parents in Palestine?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, it was. They were much older, of course, and they were not fluent in modern Hebrew, which is called Ivrit. So I was, I guess, really the only one who spoke very well. And of course, my cousin Walter spoke Hebrew well. And in fact, we're in touch with his children, just as a little aside. Somehow I think my family and Walter lost contact for some time. I don't know what happened. I was too young, I guess, to know about it, but there must have been some kind of a little conflict with them, and they were sort of separated. And I was already a volunteer at the museum, and I get a phone call from the museum. Somebody is inquiring about me. What happened was, these people, the children, he has the two sons, were trying to do a genealogy on their father's family.
This is Walter's sons.
Walter's family, Walter's sons. I didn't know them. We had met Walter, Jill and I had met Walter on one of our early trips to Israel, but we didn't talk too much about his family to us about that, and we didn't meet his sons. So something had happened there. Anyway, I get the call from the museum. Someone is asking whether we know about you. Now, what happened was, the museum has a lot of things that we had contributed, including a lot of pictures of what happened to our family, and they were in the archives, including the picture that you showed about my parents' wedding. And they were looking for Pauly's, and with computers today, they ended up on the site of the museum site, and they put in Pauly, and voila, pictures came up, including the picture, and they said, well, it was Aachen. I mean, their father came from southern Germany, as my father did, and he saw it must be the wrong Pauly's. And so for a long time, they didn't call. But they could make no other contact. They couldn't find anybody else. So they decided to call, and they called the museum, of course, because our name and numbers is not on the site. And the museum called us, and we said, "Oh yes,
That's us.
that's us. It's okay to give out our number." And one day I get a phone call, and this is my cousin. He explains who he is, and he's now living in California. One of them is living in California, the other is living in Israel. And this is how we contact. And just recently, we got another communication from
Yesterday.
from this cousin. Yes. So they had come to our house to get information for their genealogy, and they visited us some years ago now. So at least there's some contact, and of course I'm in contact with my cousin that I talked about before, Uncle Alfred's son, and we have been in touch for a long time. In fact, his last visit was this spring. He came to visit us again when they go to Europe. He and his wife were going to Europe, and he decided to come early, and he visits his cousin, and he has another cousin here from his mother's side. So he has visited us many times, and we have visited him in Israel, and so that we're in touch.
Tell us about coming to the United States. So your father now has, I think, another brother in the United States who's willing to sponsor you.
No, well, these American side of
The American side. So
Yes.
they're willing to sponsor you to
Yes.
bring you. This is 1938. So the war has not yet happened or started. So and you came under not a German quota. You came under a Palestinian quota. Am I right about that?
Well, I don't know which quota we came under, really, but I do know that on the pictures, on our naturalization papers, where it says previous nationality, it's Palestinian.
It's Palestinian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because as you said, you'd lost your German citizenship.
Yes.
Went to Palestine.
Well, and we recovered that German citizenship later.
Yeah.
But that's another matter.
Yeah.
So I don't know how it worked. I really don't know the details. I was too young to be interested, and now it's a little late. I guess I could research that and find out but I don't.
Right.
Didn't have the urge to do
So,
it.
your parents make a second big decision to move to yet another continent, come to the United States. What was that like for you to pick up stakes and move?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we talked about my father's wasn't making too much money, and he had enough money for two tickets
For two tickets
to cross the Atlantic. And he didn't really want to ask these people if he could avoid it to pay for our tickets as well. They were already doing quite a bit. And then they remembered, my parents remembered, when they came to Palestine, they had gone to some cooperative that said they could get a job for my father. But they had to make a payment to the co-op for them to do that. Well, it turned out that they never got any job for my father, and my parents said, maybe we'll get that money back, that would help us. And so they went to the offices of the co-op, who were not at all receptive to paying them the money back. And so what to do? My mother came back the next day, and she was crying to get that money back, and they still wouldn't do it. Well, she came day after day, and they just got a little tired of this lady coming in and crying in their offices, and they gave her the money back, and now we had enough to three tickets.
So you could come. Yeah.
Well, I don't know who we would have left behind. But we came. I remember the trip very well now. I was 8 years old.
8 years old, yeah.
And almost 9, in fact. And we came in the wintertime, December, and we went by ship from Haifa to Marseille, the reverse of what we had done earlier. crossed France by train, had to spend a few days in Paris waiting for the ship to come. The ship was the Queen Mary, one of the Cunard lines, and that was a big ship for a 8-year-old.
And in fact, in World War, once the war began, it became
A
a
troop ship.
troop transport ship.
And now it's a hotel
Long Beach. Yeah.
in Long Beach, California. And one of my business trips to California, I said, I'm going to stay at the Queen Mary Hotel. It was it was close to Long Beach, and
So you remember that trip?
Oh, I remember. I was a little boy, and I ran through that ship. Had a wonderful time. My parents were very seasick. It was December, and even on the Queen Mary, it was really rocking. But I didn't get seasick. I remember that ship very well. So I'm walking down to the rooms in the hotel with the bellman.
Oh, in Long Beach?
In Long Beach, a young man, and he turns to me, and the first class cabins are the hotel rooms. And he says to me, have you ever stayed with us before? And I said, I was on this ship on one of his times when it was crossing the Atlantic, and he looked at me like I was Julius Caesar. This is ancient history. I didn't know that anybody was alive. And he was just speechless after that. Took me to this very lovely cabin.
Probably not the cabin you came over in.
Not at all. No. And I was very impressed by the cabin. It had a wonderful bathtub. You could get seawater or fresh water, depending on what kind of bath you wanted. Anyway, that was quite a memory.
Tell us, so you make that, in fact, I liked, you shared me earlier that first time you ever had a Brussels sprout, I think.
Yes, that's right. That was the first time.
But you got to the United States, stayed in New York City a short period, and then went to Cincinnati.
Very short, just a few days, and then we took the train to Cincinnati.
So what was it like to adjust to yet another country, culture, language?
Well, you saw me in class on that first picture that we saw. Of course, I spoke no English. I always tell people I'm an expert in first grade education because I've been in first grade in 3 countries with 3 different languages.
At different ages.
And different ages. And here I arrive in December. By the time school starts again, it was really January. And the teacher didn't speak Hebrew or English. Hebrew or German. And fortunately, in the class, there was a little boy who came from a home, a little first grader, who came from a home that also spoke German, which is in Cincinnati. It's not that unusual because they have a long history of German immigration. And he spoke German, and he was my translator. And I very quickly learned English.
And then you got to get out of first grade, right?
And I got out of the first grade, yes. And by the time the year was over, I was in second grade. Still 1 grade behind, but I caught up with that eventually.
How difficult was it for your parents to reestablish themselves and earn a living?
It was difficult. Economic conditions in the States at this time were beginning to deteriorate a little bit, and the Depression came along very quickly. My father tried to get a job and finally got a job in a large cafeteria operation, not cooking, but just preparing vegetables. But it was a job, and he got paid something, so he took it. And he said the job had one great advantage: he always had a seat for himself on the trolley going home, because he smelled so of onions, nobody would sit next to him. And one day he's walking to this job again, and suddenly he hears a voice calling his name, Hugo. And here we are, strangers in paradise in Cincinnati. And he hears somebody calling, he turns around. And this is a man, when he studied to be a cook, and he studied his trade, he went he had gone to Switzerland to study his trade, and this man had been in the same group learning this trade
In
as
Switzerland,
he was. And he was now a chef in one of the large hotels in Cincinnati. I just saw my father. And so I finally explained all his problems to this gentleman, and he said, "And you're doing what? Preparing vegetables?" He said, "That's terrible." He says, "Meet me in the Union Hall next week," and they made a date. He said, "I'll see that you get a job," and he did. And my father got a job as a cook very quickly in a restaurant. Happened to be two Jewish brothers. It was a businessman's restaurant, sort of. And they very quickly recognized his talents. And the cooking is not the only important thing when you're in the restaurant business. Your chef orders the food, and that's very important. If you order too much food, you'll go broke, possibly, or at least you're not going to make much less profit. And my father was very good at that, ordering. He knew his field, and he very quickly became the chef in the restaurant. And as late as before we left, he went out of that business and started a bakery with not a friend, but someone he knew, who was a baker, and of course he knew how to bake. My father, in those days, if you became a chef, you not only had to cook, you had to learn about baking as well. And then when he retired from that, they moved, and when I graduated from high school, that's when we moved to
New Jersey.
To New Jersey.
During that time, before the war began in September 1939, had your parents been able to be in touch with family members in Germany, either in Palestine or in the United States?
Well, Palestine, yes.
Okay.
Of course, my mother's brother, and I don't know about Walter, but I guess they had some contact. They tried, there was some communication with Germany until the war started. We were there in December of 38. Next year is 39. The war doesn't start till September 1st when Hitler
39.
invades Poland. So there was communication. Okay, my father and his brother Theodore communicated with their family. Of course, they were, they would have loved to have been able to get out, but this time things were really going from bad to worse. But there was some communications, and they knew. And then, of course, that stopped when the war started. Now, with Palestine was another matter. My mother's brother was there, and they were safe now in the war because nobody's going to send them back.
Right. But as far as communication with the family in Germany, as of September 1, 1939,
it pretty much petered out. Yes, there were still some little communications through the Red Cross and so forth and so on, but we didn't know what happened to the family, which was very disturbing to my parents.
When did you learn?
Well, when the war was over, and they began to look for people, and it turned out. Of course, we learned about my grandfather and my grandmother very quickly because there were records, and and my mother's brother, Uncle Alfred, had gotten information out of those records about what had happened, which I explained to you before. And my mother's sister, who had. I talked about my oldest cousin and this woman who informed us about her experiences with my cousin Ilse. My parents hoped against hope that somebody maybe had survived. Maybe the oldest girl would have survived, but we found nothing about them, and of course found nothing about that. Later we had some communication with a second cousin of mine. Her father had been a cousin of my mother, and they survived. The father did not survive, but they had fled to Belgium, and they had this one girl, Margot, And she was hidden in a convent during the Second World War, which was, and that's how she survived. Mm-hmm. And her mother came back after the war to pick her up from school. Of course, now she'd grown up in a convent, and here comes this woman who is her mother, and she was very unhappy about leaving the convent at first, but eventually that worked itself out, and they came to the United States, and I was in fact in contact with them, and her husband, who was also a survivor, died very young, unfortunately. He was my best man at our wedding. So, but there was very little contact.
What?
There was another cousin of my mother's who had been an opera singer, and she turned up one day with us. Cincinnati didn't have an opera house and an opera company, but in the summer they had what they called the summer opera, and singers would come. In the summer the Met was closed. And she was singing, she was in the choir, and she looked us up and she found us, a distant cousin of my mother's. But otherwise we found really close relatives, nothing really.
What do you know of how, I know your father died relatively early. Mm-hmm. What was the impact on your parents when the full realization of what had happened to family members?
Well, it was very heartbreaking for them, on both sides, mm-hmm. My father's family and my mother's family. But this was probably a pretty common experience. Mm-hmm. Most of my parents' friends in Cincinnati were also refugees and had come here. So it was not uncommon in this in the community my parents lived in, mm-hmm. that these things happened after the war. Right. People tried to find each other. Sometimes it would work. Other times it was. But the odds were against you because the greatest number of Jews, particularly from Germany and so forth, were dead, were killed.
Kurt, we have time to turn to our audience for a few questions. Does that sound okay?
Okay.
I have many more I'd like to ask you, but I think we'll give our audience an opportunity to ask you a couple of questions. I'm going to ask you one, if you would stay through the question and answer period, because I will turn back to Kurt at the end of the program for him to close the program for us. If you have a question, we ask that you use a microphone. There's a mic coming down either aisle. Try to make your question as brief as you can. I'll do my best to repeat the question so that everybody, including Kurt and I, hear the question. So anybody have a question they'd like to ask Kurt? Otherwise, I'll just continue. Do we have a brave soul? Not yet. Oh, there we go. Okay.
So I would like to know how you were received in the United States. How did Americans, what did they think about what was going on?
The question, Kurt, is what did Americans think when you came here? What did they think was going on, and how were you received?
Well, we were received by people who were somewhat related to us, even distantly sometimes. My parents acclimated to the States pretty quickly. They had to. They didn't have much choice. But it worked out pretty well. And of course, at that age, I acclimated very quickly.
And you were in a community that had a large
yes,
German
I had a lot of other, and most of my, as I said, most of my parents' friends were people like them, immigrants. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I went to school, so I was exposed to a broader spectrum of friends. Mm-hmm. I had friends, some of them were immigrants and some of them weren't. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do we have another question? I wanted, while we're waiting, I wanted to ask you, Kurt, Jill, your wife, has been with us each year since we began the program in 2000. So many times we've had a conversation with Jill. This is your first time publicly speaking. What motivated you to do this?
Well, I've heard Jill speak about her experiences quite a few times, and a lot of other people in this museum. And I guess, and I know that a lot of those people who have spoken in the past aren't here anymore. You know, we're all advancing in age very quickly, and I decided maybe it was time for me to put this on the record for us, for my family.
Well, thank you for doing that. One other question I have for you. You mentioned early, and we saw in the photographs, you're related to Anne Frank.
Yes.
I'm sure our audience would love to hear just a little bit more about that.
Well, what happened, of course, was, as I said, Mrs. Frank's grandfather, Annie Frank's great-grandfather, married someone in my mother's family, an aunt of my mother. And it was a small Jewish community, relatively speaking. And they were very close, even as cousins. So my mother knew them quite well. And
do you have any recollection of the family?
I really don't have any recollection of the family myself. My mother always said that sometimes when they would come back from Holland, I had played with Annie, who was a little bit older than I was, but I can't really say that I remember that.
Okay.
Although she explained a lot about the family to me and to Jill, which we found out was pretty reliable what she told, because we've seen the biographical record on her family. Whatever my mother said seemed to be quite
right,
accurate.
I before we close, I just I think probably like everybody in the room, we have to really sort of think about the fact that you've pieced together information about what you went through different happenstance ways, going back to Germany and seeing your home and finding out, the people that lived there could share with you things, and coming across the nanny again after all these years, because of technology, family members being able to find you and or at least inquire, are you families? I was just so, all these years later, you're still filling in many, many details. It's pretty remarkable. Remarkable. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person has the last word, and so I will turn back to Kurt to close our program. Before I do, I want to thank all of you for being with us. Remind you that we'll have a first-person program each Wednesday and Thursday through the middle of August. So we hope that you might come back this year, or if not, the museum's website will have information about first person for next year. When Kurt's done, our photographer Joel will come up on the stage, and he's going to take a photograph of Kurt with you as the backdrop. So please stay with us so that he can get that image taken, if you don't mind. So Kurt.
Okay. I guess I of course feel I'm kind of a split. On one side, I have this experience of having fled and growing up as an immigrant and so forth. On the other side, we're Americans, and I grew up that way. I went to school here in this country, and as you mentioned before, I was drafted during the Korean War. And I always tell the world, I gave Uncle Sam 2 years of my life, and then he gave me 4 years at an Ivy League school.
G.I. Bill.
And being a disabled veteran, fortunately not too disabled, but somewhat, it doesn't bother me now, but it did when we first got married. It was still noticeable. My uncle, a lot of people get paid. Their fathers have to pay their tuition. In my case, my rich uncle Sam paid for the tuition, and I really enjoyed that time. And I took advantage of that. So that was, and we feel, Jill and I, we have this mixed thing. You know, our children are, of course, 100% American. They were born here, and but they know about this as well, and so I think that kind of broadens their perspective a little bit in the world, to know that what happened and that what their parents went through, and their ancestors who are no longer with us. So I think that probably has some effect on the way we live in this country.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you.
And of course the museum has been a wonderful
Right.
contact for us, and we've really enjoyed all these years that we've worked with the museum.
You put a lot of time here.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kurt.